Modern.
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 We're prepping for a voyage.
Modern.
The force of an old-fashioned equals whiskey mass times bitters acceleration.
Why don't you make that a double?
Modern Bar Cart.
What's shaking, cocktail fans? Welcome back to another episode of the Modern Bar Cart podcast. I'm your host, Eric Kozlik, and thanks for joining me for another fantastic interview episode where we sit down with some of the best and brightest in the cocktail and spirits industry and pump them for information about their areas of specialty. This week's guest is Taka Amano of New American Spirits, makers of Umai Shochu. And what, pray tell, is Shochu, you may ask? In fact, that's the same question I asked myself when I met Taka for the first time. In really basic terms, Shochu is a traditional Japanese spirit. Today, it stands side by side with sake and Japanese whiskey as one of the most popular spirits in Japan and beyond. We'll let Taka tell us a lot more about Shochu in just a moment, but right now, as always, I want to give you the chance to make yourself a drink. This week's featured cocktail is the Highball. It's light, sessionable, refreshing, and a really perfect way to get to know your favorite spirits just a little better. Now, I'm going to start off by pumping the brakes a bit because a highball isn't technically a cocktail. It's a mixed drink. And the operative difference between a cocktail and a mixed drink is how many ingredients there are and what you have to do to combine these things. In a highball, there's only two ingredients, a spirit and seltzer or sparkling water. And in a highball, you're not doing a whole lot of, shaking or diluting of the constituent ingredients. However, there is some real beauty to the highball, and that beauty is in its incredible versatility. You can make it with any spirit you please, and the recipe is as follows. In a tall highball or Collins glass filled with ice, combine 2 ounces of your favorite spirit and 6 to 8 ounces of seltzer water or sparkling water. It's as simple as that. Or is it? Well, a lot of folks out there in the craft bartending world make a big to-do about stirring the highball, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? It makes sense that you'd want to either use a reusable straw or a swizzle stick or even a bar spoon to give your highball a little agitation to enhance the mixing and chilling of the ingredients. Some folks have a superstition as to the precise number of times a highball should be stirred, but if you ask me, just give it 3 or 4 rotations around the glass and then go to town. One last thing I'll throw out there on the subject of highballs is that opportunity to add your own signature touch. This is inevitably where I plug our Embitterment bitters to add a nice bitters float on top, maybe lavender or orange, but this episode I'm going to spare you that lecture and instead recommend a nice herbal garnish like mint or thyme or basil as a great way to add both color and amazing aroma to your highball. So, now that you've got all the makings of your next sessionable summer drink, let's turn our attention to a spirit that happens to make a really amazing highball, Shochu. In this fascinating conversation with Taka Amano of New American Spirits, some of the topics we cover include how Taka used his experience traveling and working within the Japanese biotech space to become an ambassador for Shochu here in the US. Shochu base grains and production methods, including the use of Aspergillus. That's right, black mold. The history of Shochu distillation in Japan, including how it's becoming one of the most popular spirits on the market today. Shochu cocktails and the best way to enjoy Shochu at home and abroad. How to find a quality bottle here in the US, and much, much more. Taka is a fascinating guy to speak with, and I couldn't be a bigger fan of his product and the great work they're doing in Maryland. So if you're in the Mid-Atlantic, please try and pick up a bottle of Umai Shochu and sip on that smooth, silky beverage as you enjoy this really enlightening interview with my friend, Taka Amano. Taka, thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Eric.
So today we are talking about Shochu, correct?
Shochu.
Shochu. Yeah. So we gotta nail down that pronunciation.
Right.
So I'll let you take us through the pronunciation of it in a sec. But can you just introduce yourself generally and tell folks the story of how you came to be here doing what you're doing today?
Sure. So I've been for pretty much my entire career, I've been a consultant in cultures and connecting the Japanese and American cultures. So I've had a consulting business for 25 years. And part of what I have done the last 10 years, I spent a week and a half to 2 weeks every month, pretty much every month, traveling to Japan. And what I was doing was I was helping American companies, mostly biotech companies, sell their products in the Japanese market. And what you do there is you work with distributors, regional distributors. These are old, generations-owned, family-owned businesses that are very local and cultural, and you do a lot of personal interactions with them. And so, I was the president of a subsidiary of a biotech company, and for 7 years we ran that. And what you do is you go to a lot of meetings, you go to a lot of dinners, a lot of golfing, so a lot of drinking going on.
Gotcha.
And my go-to drink was Shochu.
Okay.
As you probably would, as the listeners may think, so what the hell is Shochu, right? And Shochu just doesn't have very much awareness in the United States, and yet it is the number one drink in Japan. It's my go-to drink when I'm in Japan. When I'm in the States, I drink bourbon, and in Japan, I drink Shochu. And I've always thought, why don't we have Shochu in America? And kind of one thing led to another. I've always wanted to have a manufacturing type business of my own. And this seemed like the ideal combination of bridging the cultures, doing a manufacturing business, bringing a new industry to Maryland, all of that.
Great. Yeah, I often find that Shochu gets mentioned in the same breath as sake. I don't know if that's correct or not.
Yep.
I don't know. Yeah, I assume they're actually fairly different. But why don't you kind of tell us what Shochu is and kind of where it sits on the spectrum of world spirits? I think that's a good place to start.
Sure. So in Japan, they have something that they call kokushu. That means national alcohol, right? And the two kokushu are what we call sake. In Japan, they call it nihonshu or seishu, and shochu. Those are the two kokushu in Japan. And sake is a fermented beverage. It's more like a beer or a wine. Shochu is distilled. And so that's the major difference between the two. The positioning of shochu, even though we don't know a lot about it in the United States, it's actually a top-selling drink elsewhere, especially in the East. As a matter of fact, the number one selling shochu in Japan at different points, and I think in 2010, they were the number 3 brand in the world. We're talking, still, Smirnoff, Bacardi, Ichiko, that kind of thing.
Wow.
So they sell that much shochu.
So it's very widely distilled, and since you've spent so much time going back and forth between Japan and the United States, why do you think it hasn't caught on in the United States?
Yeah, so I have my theories about this. So people also, when I talk about shochu, I often get I know soju. And soju is a similar thing. It's not the same, but it's a similar product that is Korean in origin. Okay. And soju is the stuff that comes in little green bottles. So the reason I bring soju up is that when you go to a liquor store like a DLC in Montgomery County, they actually have a Asian section or even a soju section. And I was, doing some research, looking at the shelves, and you see the soju, the little green bottles of Korean soju lined up there, and you look at the labels, and they're written in Hangul, right, in the Korean language. Can't read it. I happen to be in the industry, and so I'm familiar with some of the brands. I pick it up, I turn it over, I look at the English label on the back, and I go, oh yeah, so this one's Jindo or whatever. And then if you look at even like the sake bottles, and there are very few shochu bottles that you'll find around here, but if you look at one, it's got kanji, which is the Japanese scripted language written on the label. Now, shochu manufacturers are very proud of their labels. The kanji labels that they have, the names that they use, there's a lot of history and background and a lot of kind of cultural oomph behind that. So they're very proud of it. And they're cool looking, if you're Japanese. And so I can read those, right? Because I'm Japanese and I read Japanese. And realizing, yeah, but if I'm American, I couldn't read that any more than I can read the Hangul bottles. So that's number one. I think the marketing is way off base.
Okay.
And the other thing I think is that everything, all shochu except for mine, is imported. And so there's issues that come in around that, pricing and distribution and all that kind of thing.
Of course. Yeah, that makes sense. So obviously, one of your projects is to bring shochu to America in an accessible way. And I think that the best way we can do that right now is talk about what it tastes like and why somebody who's listening to this might want to go out of their way to find some.
Right. So shochu looks like, moonshine or Everclear when you look at it in the bottle. And, we're a brand new distillery, right? But so whenever people taste our shochu, probably 9 times out of 10, probably 99 times out of 10, I get a particular response to it. And so maybe we should try.
Yeah, let's see if I have that response. I'm curious now.
All right.
I want to see if I'm the rule or the exception here. Yeah. All right. So we've got the the Glencairn tulip glass here. Great for tasting spirits. I'm just going to get the nose here. And I mean, to me, it smells, like you would expect a white whiskey to smell. Mm-hmm. It's kind of bready smelling. And it's got a little bit of, I'd say, like a little bit of fruitiness on the nose. I can't really identify, I would go so far as to say almost pineapple-y on the nose. Like pineapple's not a citrus, but I get a little bit of that. I'm gonna take the palate, and it's really smooth.
There you go. Bingo.
Yeah.
99 times out of 100, I get the really smooth reaction.
Yeah, it's really interesting on the nose, and I would go so far as to say that the nose and the palate are two fairly dissimilar experiences. It's a little bit darker on the palate, a little bit of almost butterscotch on the finish, and a wholly pleasant tasting experience.
Yeah,
that you might not always expect from a raw clear spirit.
Yeah, thank you. Exactly. Right. So brand new distillery, clear spirit. What you're expecting is a moonshine or a white dog,
right.
But that's very much not what shochu is. So even though it looks like a vodka or a rum, it's got its own unique, and we make ours with barley, organic barley.
Okay.
And so I think it definitely has that barley, undertone to it. And that will show up in cocktails. The barley-ishness will show up in cocktails.
Sure. Yeah, the cereal nature of the base grain. And I think that's a really nice point to make, because that's something that a lot of American distillers really go for. They're really proud of their base grain and the characters that they're able to, to pull out of it. It's like the artist pulling the sculpture out of the raw piece of marble, right? So I think it's great that you're using organic. That's always it's great to know that there's quality ingredients going into it. But can you maybe talk a little bit about how you take it from the grain and turn it into this end product that we just tasted?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about the shochu process, so shochu can typically be made with a number of grains or starches. And the main ones are sweet potato, what they call in Japan imo, barley, which is mugi, and then there's rice, right? Kome.
Okay.
And then it's also made with a variety of other buckwheat, soba and other things also. And in the Japanese official, the Japanese version of TTB, there's actually an official list of what you can use to make shochu. So, and it's a big, long list.
Right.
But those three, the sweet potato, the barley, and the rice are the three big ones. Barley is probably the biggest one. Sweet potato tends to have more body and flavor. And actually, even in Japan, a lot of people find the sweet potato version to be hard to drink. And so shochu in general, there's a culture around this where originally it was a very working class, blue collar. You drink shochu because you can't afford sake, nihonshu, kind of culture background behind it until probably the last 10, 15 years.
Okay.
So speaking to the production, so we make ours with barley, organic barley. And one of the interesting things is, Western alcohols are almost always made with malted barley, right? That is where the enzymes come in to sugarize the grain, the starch. Well, in the shochu process, we don't use malted barley. Our barley, we use pearled barley. So pearled barley is just the kind of barley that you would cook and eat. It's polished barley is what it is. Just kind of a side note, I'd love to use local Maryland barley. And I've been talking to barley farmers. The thing about it is in Maryland, all of our barley either goes to seed to make more barley, or it's malted, which is an unhusked product, or it goes to chicken feed. And so there's nobody who's making pearled barley. So as far as I've found so far, nobody has a pearling machine.
Got it.
And so right now I'm having to bring it in from out of state, but we'll work on this as we go forward.
Yeah, we'll put out an all points bulletin to the farmers who are listening right now, and then see if anybody has a pearling machine that they can get out here
and have some interest in this. As we increase in volume, I think it'll become a more. I think it's a fun project actually. So we take the pearled barley, steam it, and then the first batch of the pearled barley in a particular batch of shochu is made into koji, which is the secret ingredient, right? So our product is made with only 4 ingredients. It's the organic barley, filtered water, yeast, and koji.
Okay.
So koji is a biological. It's Aspergillus luchensis. And what it is it's a kind of a mold. And it's a similar thing that is used in, certainly sake, making miso, making, there's a lot of fermented foods in the East. Soy sauce, those are all fermented products.
Right.
They all have their own different kind of aspergillus that they use. So in our case, with shochu, Aspergillus luchensis is the kind of aspergillus that is used by a genuine shochu manufacturer. Backstory to this, when we first started the process here at American Shochu Company, I went to the USDA, because it's an alcohol product, right? So we got to do everything on the up and up.
Right.
Went to the USDA and told them that I needed to import some Aspergillus luchensis, and they said, you can't do that. It's not in our database.
Right.
And by the way, so there's 2 kinds of koji. There's white koji and black koji. Shirokoji, kurokoji. And they said, and I understand there's something called black koji. That's Aspergillus niger, right? That's black mold, right?
Yeah.
And it's a hazardous toxic substance.
Right.
Not allowed to bring this stuff in. And so I had to go through black koji is actually not Aspergillus niger. It's Aspergillus luchensis kawachi, yada, yada.
Okay.
And this is similar product to what you use in miso and Aspergillus oryzae, which is what you use for sake. And it's a food product. It's a very traditional long-term food product in Japan. And they said, okay, we'll put it in the database and you can bring it in, but there's some restrictions of it. And so I actually have to hand carry it through the airports. I have to let them know 60 days in advance and hand carry it in. And this is all to say that as far as I know, I'm the first legally imported Aspergillus luchensis site in the United States.
That's really good. So, all right, I've got this is a really interesting place that I'd like to stay for a couple minutes because of a couple of things. One, when we talk to distillers and we talk about their methods, almost always, except this is the only exception I can really think of, they're talking about yeast,
right,
that they're using to initiate the fermentation process that kind of kicks off the alcohol creation, I guess, before they put it into the still. And so I guess number one is I was not aware that mold could do the same thing. Without getting too much into the weeds, can you explain why mold can do the same thing that yeast can?
So actually, it's not. So we actually have a yeast in the process also. But what the mold does is it does what the malted barley does. So the malted barley, when they sprout the barley, it puts off some enzymes, and that is what saccharizes the grains.
Okay.
right? So in our case, it's the koji that breaks down or, changes the barley, creates the enzymes that initiates the sugarizing process, and we add more barley. So it takes the whole batch of barley that we're using and sugarizes it. And then there's a little secret to this, because our fermentation process is almost 2 weeks. It'll be as long as 2 weeks, right?
Wow.
And anybody who knows the distilling process, a whiskey is what, 48 hours?
Right. Yeah.
Right? And so, and this actually creates some production problems, because it means that you have to store all that fermentation batch for 2 weeks. Each batch has to sit for a week and a half to 2 weeks, but it's also sitting at room temperature, open lid, for 2 weeks.
Wow.
So what'll happen? It'll rot, right? It'll get contaminated. It'll rot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it doesn't, because of a little secret in the koji process. If you handle the temperature control correctly, the koji, not only does it create the sugarizing enzymes, it also creates citric acid, and it's a very specific strain and a very specific combination of processes that we developed right here at FITSI at the Frederick Innovative Technology Center. That's why we're in a biotechnology incubator. So we had to recreate the process. Actually, the process is a traditional process, and yet it's a process that typically is handed down from generation to generation in family-owned distilleries. And so even though there's a general sense of how you're making it, you actually don't know what the details are until you do this. And I had a lot of help from my Japanese contacts. I'm very friendly with the Japan Brewing Society. The chairman there is a fan of what we're doing here in America. And so I got some support, but at the end of the day, we had to develop the process ourselves.
Right.
And so the citric acid preserves the fermentation while you're fermenting for 2 weeks.
Wow. Yeah. That's completely different than all of the distilling and fermenting processes that usually, when I'm doing a distillery tour, usually I like just zone out when they're talking, because I've heard the bourbon spiel, I've heard the gin spiel so many times that it's like, okay, I get it. Let's get to the tasting part. That's what I'm concerned with. But this is really fascinating. I was not I didn't do as much research as perhaps I should have before we sat down, and I'm just taken aback by that. Yeah. What about the history of shochu? You mentioned that it was a fairly blue-collar product, and I do think that kind of maps onto some trends that we saw in Western cultures as well, because just like imported things like brandies and nice, French wines were drunk by the wealthier people, while the moonshines and the bourbons were a little bit more rural and kind of blue collar. I think that maps on, but I'm interested in kind of figuring out how shochu kind of developed. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of theories about this, and they say that shochu goes back to the 16th century. As a matter of fact, one of the earliest in the shochu world, everybody tells this story. They found an archaeological excavation of an old temple, and they found a wood plank that had graffiti on it, where the workmen had written down that the landlord here, the daimyo here, he's so cheap, he won't even give us shochu. And that is from the 16th century, which is how they say, they attribute how far back it goes in Japanese history. And they think that it came over from Southeast Asia somewhere, or, there's various theories of exactly where it came from. It came from Korea, it came from Southeast Asia, it came through the islands to the south of Japan. And, people don't really know what's going on there. But the deal was that in Japan, especially ancient historic Japan, is a rice-based culture. It's a rice-based economy. They used to grade the power of each of the daimyo, the feudal lords, by how many, they're basically barrels, how many barrels of rice that they were worth.
Wow.
Right. Sengoku daimyo is 1,000-barrel daimyo. So and it's that, rice and money were directly connected.
Okay.
So, and you make sake with rice. Sure. And there's that aspect of it, and there's also a religious aspect of it. It's a very high, top 1% kind of drink. So if you're not, then what do you drink to get drunk? You can take the leftovers from making sake, and you can re-ferment it and distill it to pull out the alcohol. That's what shochu originally was.
Okay.
The sweet potato version is even further down so where that's from in Kyushu, the southern island in Japan. Traditionally a poorer area of historic ancient Japan, and not as much rice, and also from a climate perspective, not so much rice. And so they came up with the idea of making it with a different starch, with the sweet potato. That's where that came from.
That's really interesting. One thing that I would recommend for people who are interested in learning something that, historically they might not be super familiar with, is taking a look into Japanese history. Because while we were developing one of our products, our Iki Japanese bitters, we did a lot of research into Japanese culture, some of the Japanese aesthetic traditions. And incidentally, I ended up watching a lot of History Channel series on YouTube. I rewatched The Last Samurai, and regardless of certain historical mistranslations or misinterpretations that are in there, it did become clear to me that there's a lot of really different trends in Japanese history and culture than there are in Western culture. And you really see, when European countries and the United States tried to start making more contact with Japan, there's actually a lot of resistance there, which was kind of interesting. So there's a film that's fairly recent called Silence, I believe.
I haven't seen it yet, but yeah,
I watched it, and it's a really it's like not a happy movie. It's not like a rom-com. It's and it's got the guy from Taken. Oh man. Yes, Liam Neeson.
Oh yeah,
it's got Liam Neeson, and so it's an interesting movie. I definitely recommend it. But it kind of it's a different part of history.
It's the Jesuit thing, right?
Yes,
yeah,
it's the Jesuits.
And there's a little bit of that in the original Shogun, if you remember that, right?
Right. Yeah. So traditionally, Japan and the United States and Western culture did not really have a super friendly rapport. But so I like that kind of you're blazing kind of that trail with Shochu here. So I know when I did an episode about vodka that there were some traditions that my friend Alla, who's Russian, kind of explained to me about the way that vodka was consumed, and kind of a similar thing. Vodka was kind of the blue collar, everybody drink, and they developed some customs around this. So I was wondering if there's any ways that Shochu is traditionally consumed, whether that involves toasting or occasions where it is commonly drunk, or maybe even the glassware or hardware that's used to consume it.
So, I mentioned that I spent a lot of time in Japan going to dinners. So if you go to a Japanese business dinner, everybody starts with a glass of beer. And in Japan, beer is lager. It's a lager beer. Kirin, Sapporo, that kind of thing, right? So everybody starts with the beer. And then once you get through the beer phase, people kind of branch out into what they want to drink, which oftentimes might be a sake, might be a shochu. So my go-to drink in that situation was always shochu on the rocks. And that's kind of a old fart Japanese businessman salariman kind of thing to drink. Although and actually it's a little bit cultural snobbery that goes into being a shochu drinker. But so you got shochu, you got sake. So on the rocks is a very typical way to do it. Now shochu is typically a 25%, 24% alcohol by volume. And so it's lower alcohol than a scotch or a whiskey, right? Scotch and whiskeys, by the way, come at the end of the night. When you leave the restaurant and you go to the bar afterwards, or you go to, the cabaret kind of thing, that's where you drink your whiskeys.
Okay. I didn't realize that it was a lower ABV. We probably should have mentioned that before. Why is that?
It's just tradition, from what I can tell, because you can get a 40% shochu. I mean, I can make a 40% shochu. They'll come as high as 44%. Japanese law says that it has to be under 45.
Okay.
But and we don't have the same laws here, so we could do a higher one if we wanted to.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. So what that immediately made me think of, and this is cocktail related. So we'll talk before we jump into the lightning round. We'll definitely talk about cocktails. But I've recently gotten into the trend of using very high proof spirits as like a float on a cocktail. So like I'll make a daiquiri, and then my co-founder Ethan gave me this really nice bottle of overproof rum, and I'll float like just a bar spoon of that on top of my daiquiri, and it just adds a little bit of fire to it. But what do you do with a lower proof spirit? I mean, but the big affordance I can think of is that it's easier to sip without getting super drunk. So that's a nice feature. Are there any other features of having something that's a little bit lower proof?
So as you say, the nice thing about drinking shochu on the rocks is it pretty much you can drink 2 of them for every, say Booker's that you're going to drink, right?
Of course.
Which is actually my go-to bourbon.
That's a good go-to. That's a really good go-to.
So that's number one. And by the way, a lot of people in Japan will also drink shochu with water, water and ice. Shochu with a little bit of warm water is a good way to go too. And one of the neat things about shochu is that it retains its flavor no matter how you dilute it. It's very interesting. You put more water in it and it still retains its shochu flavor.
Okay.
And so the truth is you could do shochu in water and it doesn't take too much away from the experience of drinking the particular kind of shochu that you're drinking. When you're in Japan, there's hundreds of variety brands out there now. So never met a shochu I didn't like, actually, but
nice. That actually does kind of make sense, because when we make our cocktail bitters, obviously we're using a neutral grain spirit, like most people do, and it's easy to. I'll put it this way: the more water you add to it in order to proof it down to what you want your end proof to be, the more it takes. So essentially, it's easier to get that alcohol down to 90, the first 10% than it is the following 10%. And then the following 10%, you have to add more and more water, because logically there's more water already in there. So I never thought of having a lower proof spirit retain its flavor with dilution as being a feature. That's a really cool feature to bring out. Let's get into cocktails, since we're kind of almost there. I don't think there's too many traditional shochu cocktails that you're going to find in, those old classic cocktail books.
Right.
The Harry Craddock books, or the Jerry Thomas cocktail books. But this is a cocktail and home bartending podcast, and I know that, especially for the large number of our listeners who are here in the DMV and who are going to seek out, your stuff, how would we think about starting to use this in cocktails?
So there's 2 aspects of this, and the thing about it is bringing shochu to America. The neat thing for me is finding out what people will do with it.
Yeah,
and I want. Selling shochu to a Japanese restaurant is no brainer. They should have it. They don't like to have it because it's expensive, because they have imported product, but ours is a locally made product. So I think that is a no-brainer thing, but that's not a lot of fun, right? That's kind of a gimme.
Yeah, right.
Getting it incorporated into the American culture, really creating a new American spirit, right? Making something that we are creating right here in Frederick, that we're making in Maryland, ultimately we'll incorporate Maryland barley, and launching that as kind of the new craft spirit, the brand new spirit in the American market. That's where the fun starts. And what people will do with the show, because it's a very versatile base, you can pretty much mix it with anything. Traditionally in Japan, they make what's called a chuhai, a shochu highball. So in Japan, highballs are always mixed with soda, right? So chuhai, a very or the standard chuhai is lemon lime soda. A shot of shochu with lemon lime soda and ice. Makes a very simple, gentle drink. It is the most popular thing in Japan. The other thing that they like in Japan is oolong hais. So that's oolong tea and shochu. So oolong highballs. Green tea and shochu. That's a pretty common thing. They call those ryokcha hai.
Okay, and with the
highballs.
teas, will they typically serve it chilled or hot?
Pretty much chilled.
Okay.
Right. Shochu with warm water is a thing, especially in the winter. It's kind of like a toddy. It's actually my wife's favorite way to drink akakiri, which is a particular kind of imo shochu. So But other than that, it will mix, a lot of a lot of the ladies that I worked with in Japan, their thing was cassis, shochu and cassis,
Okay.
right? So what is that? Cassis.
Yes.
So here, I would guess that a similar kind of thing would be like shochu and pomegranate.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's like, I know that there actually is a local cassis or creme de cassis producer. Our friends out at Mount Defiance in Middleburg, Virginia, actually make a version using the black currants that are grown in New York, which is one of the few states that has declassified the cultivation of that particular plant because it's been banned due to a certain blight propensity that we've kind of eliminated by now. So it's okay to get them back online and growing here in the United States. But yeah, that's almost like a the French version would be like a Kir or a Kir Royale, and so that's kind of like the Shochu Kir almost. Yeah. Cool.
Now we're in the Volt restaurant here in Frederick, right? Brian Voltaggio's flagship restaurant.
Yep.
So Brian was one of the first people to come by the distillery, and he was actually my first customer.
Oh, that's great.
And we did the tasting in the distillery, and I got the same reaction from him. Hey, this is smooth.
Yeah.
Local product, love to carry you. And so he incorporated it into his restaurant for us. And they are at the moment doing about a case a month. And we just started in February. So it's really cool. And, I mean, nothing could be cooler than having a celebrity chef designing your cocktails for you, right?
Sure.
So far they've come up with a Shochu Fizz. And Damon Shattuck, the head bartender there, tells me it's a 10-minute shake.
It's a 10-minute shake.
But it's a fizz.
Yeah.
So if you're familiar with fizzes, right, they've got the high egg white head, and it's a beautiful looking cocktail. But he says, not sure that we want people to be ordering too many of these.
Right. Yeah, that you always feel the Ramos Gin Fizz in New Orleans is kind of like you got to get one when you're there, and so you kind of see the look of kind of resignation in the bartender's face when you order one, because that's the next 10 minutes of his life, unfortunately. But cool. So I imagine, I see we got tonic water on the table, so I imagine it's just great in tonic.
So I've discovered that shochu and tonic is a thing. It's when, for lack of anything better, it's can become my go-to if I don't want it on the rocks, if I want to dilute it down a little bit, if I want to drink longer and slower. It's so smooth that if you put it on the rocks, you'll find yourself just kind of knocking them down sometimes.
Right. Well, less dangerous than a gin and tonic, since it's a lower proof. How do you find that it reacts with citrus? Because one of the things I did notice about it was it's got, I don't want to call it a neutral taste, I don't want to call it a basic taste in terms of like acid base, but it's not a particularly bright tasting drink. So how does it react when you put something like a lemon or a lime juice in it?
So it's funny, it's got a very, so as a Japanese who's used to drinking these, it's a very familiar thing. It has a neutral feel to it, is what I always find. So, I'm a bourbon drinker, I'm a shochu on the rocks guy. So it's not something that I actually personally go to by choice, but I think that people who do like that kind of drink, it makes for a very gentle, smooth, mild kind of drink. And I think a lot of times that's what people like about it.
Sure. Yeah. Really interesting. Well, what we'll kind of put out into the ether of the podcasting space is that we need more shochu cocktails,
right?
And we want people to get their hands on this product, and we'll at the end of the show we'll let you tell folks all about how to get in contact with you and how to experience your product, whether that's in their home or at one of the local restaurants here in Frederick or in the Mid-Atlantic. But yeah, this is a part of the creative process. Whenever you make a product, we just launched 4 new bitters flavors that aren't really out there. So we are actively soliciting people to go out, experiment with this stuff, and tell us what they like. Because I know what I like, but I drink bitters all the time. My palate's very different from what's out there, and so that's my call to action for this episode. Please seek out shochu, whether it's something that's imported, or if you're lucky enough to be able to get your hands on this particular product, please tell us what you like in your shochu cocktails because we want more of them.
Fascinated to know what people like with their shochu.
Yeah. Is there anything else about shochu that you want to just talk about before we jump into the lightning round?
So I think that what I would emphasize with bringing shochu to America is, there's a way that we drink shochu in Japan, and it's very popular. We sell more shochu in Japan than sake the last 10 years. That's mostly because young people have taken to the fact that there's chuhai as a thing. The truth is, izakaya bars, restaurants, they love their shochu sales because it's a profitable product for them. But what people do with what they like to mix into shochu, and I can imagine anything. I kind of picture almost like a bubble tea kind of thing, right?
Sure.
Your strawberry and kiwis, your mango and pineapples, chocolate with shochu if that's your thing. I'd love to find out what people are interested in.
It does seem like it embraces other flavors really well.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's jump into the lightning round questions here with our first one, which is, what is your favorite cocktail? And if you don't have a favorite of all time, what's something that you've been recently more obsessed with?
Yeah, that's really easy. So my favorite cocktail is the Manhattan. And I've been into Manhattans for quite a while, and I find myself ordering Manhattans in New York City, and my wife's like, isn't that a cliche? but this is before. I mean, I think there's a Manhattan resurgence going on right now.
Sure, yeah,
way before that, and so
right.
Yeah.
Interesting. A couple sub questions then: bourbon or rye?
Bourbon.
And do you have a sweet vermouth preference?
I like my I'm hitting a mind blank.
Carpano.
Yeah, exactly. I like my Carpano Antigua. But so when you do Booker's and Carpana, you're talking about a really, really heavy drink.
Yeah.
That is kind of my go-to. But on a off day, I'm more of maybe a Baker's and Dubonnet or
okay.
Yeah,
got it. Yeah, Dubonnet Rouge, very nice. And orange twist or brandied cherry?
There's a kind of maraschino cherry that they actually sell at Giant, and it's an organic.
Ooh.
And then, I've had friends who say, oh my God, I can't believe that you used, the little red ball of death. But that actually tends to be what I put in my, yeah.
Yeah, you use the red ball of death.
Right.
Nice. Yeah, the color is striking.
Yeah.
If you were a cocktail tool or ingredient, what would you be and why?
Yeah, that's funny. So, like a lot of Japanese, just to go off the side just a little bit,
sure.
my wife is half Irish, and I have funny stories about that we might do some other time. But, we talk about how wide, I found, I'll just say this part. I found that I have run into more Japanese men married to Irish women than you would believe. Huh. And it's like, why is that? That's weird. Well, so what I always say is, they're Ireland and Japan. They're both island countries. We both have alcoholic dads. So when I was a kid, from a very young age, I grew up knowing my dad. His drink was whiskey and water, right? Scotch and water.
Yeah.
And he would, put ice in the glass. And so one of these 3-year-olds who knew what the sound of ice in glass sounded like, really, really pathetic, right? But what you do with that is you mix it with what in Japan we call marora. And so marora, right? Which I knew as a stir stick.
Okay.
Right? Now, I realized recently that the word comes from muddler.
Okay.
Right? Like a muddling stick, right?
Yeah.
Right? And so it kind of got, side bastardized in Japan just to mean something that you stir the drink with.
Okay.
Right. So I don't know if that's what I am. And you could riff on the whole mixing cultures and right kind of thing. But what comes to mind is the marora.
I like that. Well, and it's interesting too, because especially of the prevalence of the Japanese whiskey and the shochu highball. I feel, it's stirred, stirring those drinks is a very, special. It's part of the process because it's such a simple drink. A lot of the style and sort of the ceremony of the drink is in the stirring of it.
It is.
So I like that. That's a really cool creative answer. If you could have a cocktail with anybody, past or present, who would that be? Where would you go? What would you drink? Just kind of paint a picture for us.
Yeah. So this goes off into a different area of my life. You know, my wife is running for Board of Ed in Montgomery County here.
Okay.
And, you know, we're the truth is we're diehard progressives and have been for a long time. So I have to say that if I had the choice of someone to have a drink with, it would probably have to be Bernie Sanders.
Okay.
And, you know, actually, Paul Wellstone would be great, but he's not around. So
Sure.
That's what I would say. And, you know, what drink? Well, that's an interesting question, right? It's an interesting question. I would imagine if I'm drinking with Bernie, it would have to be, you know, nice craft beer somewhere.
Sure.
You know, maybe somewhere like Denizens, right?
Yeah. Why not? All right. Craft beer with Bernie Sanders. And, I mean, what would you talk about with him?
Oh my gosh.
Just the state of things.
All the things that, you know, missed opportunities that have gone by, what we can do next, you know, how we can change things for the better in the world.
Yeah.
You know,
seems like a real down to earth guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Cool.
You know, how we can connect with the people that he's able to connect with.
Yeah. Not an answer we've received. We've had a couple duplicates, but no Bernie Sanders. So that's a new one to the podcast. So we're going to get into a little bit of advice now in the lightning round, and I always like to ask about books because people love books. Are there any books either about cocktails or about shochu or, you know, about anything that we've spoken about today that have been particularly influential to you?
Yeah, so there's a few shochu books out there, and you know, I got to say they're all in Japanese, but I have found that the story and history of how, so there's a company in Japan called Kirishima Distillery, and they their main product is Kurokiri Black Kirishima. It's a imo shochu, it's a sweet potato shochu, and they have done a fantastic job of growing a business from the ground up in a really flat economy. And, you know, being an old, you know, working with distributors and working just kind of boots to the ground sales guy at heart, their story was just fascinating how they did that.
Okay, cool. I might hit you up via email, see if we can get links to those. Even if they're not, you know, super available to an English speaking public, we'll still slap them on the show notes page and put them up there. If you could give any piece of advice to somebody, whether this could be one of many things, if they're just starting out their journey as a home bartender, or perhaps just starting out their journey into shochu, what advice would you have for somebody?
So if you're getting into shochu, there's I think very few places where you can get a variety around here. But I think if you go up into New York, there are some izakaya that have a nice variety. And then certainly if you're doing shochu, you probably start off with a mugi, with a barley product. They're generally a little bit easier to access. And the Japanese actually will tell you that, you know, if you're starting with shochu, you want to start with barley. And then if that tickles your fancy, the sweet potato versions, imo versions now you get into a wide range of different varieties, you know, the different flavors that you can get into. But even in the barley space, you can get into the really gentle, smooth products, you know, that like our first product, like our Umai product. And, you know, our second round, actually my second round of product, I'm still debating which way to go with this, but we might either will come out with a more strong, bold barley version, or I might play around with a little bit of rye in the mash.
Yeah, traditional Maryland.
Exactly.
Yeah, traditional Maryland. I love it. Well, that's really great. Are there any quality indicators to look for if you are shopping around for shochu? And I will, you know, preface that by saying it's probably going to be difficult if you don't read Japanese. But is there anything to look for at all?
Oh gosh, the bigger difference is actually the kind of shochu, right? Is it a sweet potato? Is it an imo? Is it mugi, barley, or is it kome, rice?
Okay.
And the big difference will be with a rice product. They tend to be very sweet. And then actually people who know sake probably comes in two different versions. It's either a very vermouthy product or it's a very sweet You know, a high quality sake is sweet. Even the dry ones are very sweet.
Yep.
A rice shochu will have a lot of that same character. It's sweeter, so it's a little bit more cloying, maybe.
Sure.
So that's probably what you look for, depending on what your palate is.
Sure. And if you've ever gone to like maybe a Thai restaurant, you've had Mekong whiskey. It's got a bit of a sweetness to it there that's kind of comparable to that and puts it on that spectrum. Interesting. So we'll dive into the internet, find those different base names and stick them on the show notes page so that if you do happen to be cruising, a place that has a selection of shochu, then you can hopefully just pull up the show notes page and identify at least the base of it, or, grab somebody from the store who knows what they're talking about. And, that should have you off to the races. But I think we should give folks your digital contact info where they can reach out to you, where they can follow you on social media, and then also, the name of your product and maybe some places where they can find that.
Right. So our website is newamericanspirits.com. That's spirits with an S at the end. Let's see. So we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, but those are some variation of American shochu.
Okay. American shochu.
Yep.
Great.
And let's see.
This product is Umai,
right.
UMAI with an exclamation point at the end.
Right.
Does that have a meaning, or is that just a style, a trade name?
Umai is kind of a masculine word in Japan for tastes good, yummy.
Yeah, great.
So the joke here is you go into a Japanese bar where somebody says, "Give me a good tasting shochu, Umai shochu kure."
Yeah.
There you go.
Perfect. Oh, I love it. I love it. Oh, and you have the story right on the side right there. Cool. So we'll snap a picture of that, post it on the show notes page as well. Where can folks go to taste it? And is it available for purchase for individuals, or is it only in restaurants?
Yeah. So we have just started selling the product on the market in February. And it is currently at Volt Restaurant that we mentioned. Mm-hmm. It's also at Brewer's Alley. So those are both, iconic restaurants in Frederick. Yep. Great places. And then we're in a few liquor stores, Riverside in Frederick, Orion in Urbana. Mm-hmm. So that's the closest to Montgomery County.
Sure.
And we're currently in discussions with several bars and restaurants in both Bethesda, Silver Spring, and DC.
Great. Yeah. Well, we are rooting for you hard. We are going to keep our eyes peeled as you continue to roll out your product, amp up your production, and we look forward to seeing that hit more and more markets as you continue to grow.
Yeah. We're right in the process of expanding our production and actually looking for a little bit of investment to fund that, and
sure,
we're off to the races.
Great. Well, Taka, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Eric.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's two big things you can do for us here at Modern Bar Cart. One would be to tell your friends and family if you think they'd enjoy listening to us talk about cocktails. And if they don't download podcasts, they can always stream our episodes on their desktop directly from the show notes page at modernbarcart.com. The other thing you can do to help would be to head on over to iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts and leave us a review. 5 stars are great, but we're more interested in your feedback. And the beauty is, the more reviews we have, the easier it will be for other folks out there to learn about our show. We're trying to start a cocktail revolution here, and by spreading the word, you're helping us fight the good fight. You can always reach us by emailing podcast@modernbarcart.com if you're looking for cocktail or bartending advice, or if you're a pro who would like to pull up a mic and be interviewed for all to hear. Also, definitely follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Modern Bar Cart for cocktail porn, recipes, and entertaining tips. And keep an eye out for new product releases and special offers, which are happening all the time. We love our listeners, and we really enjoy giving you exclusive discounts and sneak peeks at our latest and greatest cocktail projects. This episode may be over, but for you, the mixological fun and adventures are just beginning. So remember, folks, drink responsibly and experiment boldly. This episode was made possible with editing and production assistance by Samantha Reed, Shochu Insights and Black Mold Clarification by Taka Amano, and a little bit of interview magic by yours truly. This has been a Modern Bar Cart production, copyright 2018.